From tension to detonation, how U.S.-Venezuela relations reach the brink. Explosions in Caracas, U.S. military strikes, and a claim that a sitting president has been captured. This did not begin overnight, and what we are witnessing now is the collapse of a relationship that has been breaking for decades. To understand the shockwaves of January 3, 2026, we must rewind far beyond the explosions and headlines and trace the long chain of decisions, power struggles, and unresolved tensions that slowly transformed a political rivalry into open confrontation. In the early hours of January 3, 2026, residents of Caracas were jolted awake by explosions, power outages, and reports of low-flying aircraft as news spread that the United States had launched military strikes against Venezuelan targets. Within hours, the situation escalated further when U.S. officials claimed that Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife had been captured and removed from the country, a statement that immediately sent shockwaves through Latin America and beyond. Venezuela rejected the claim outright, labeling the strikes an act of military aggression and imperialism, while declaring a state of emergency and mobilizing its security forces. Whether fully verified or not, the announcement alone marked a historic rupture because it crossed a line the United States had avoided in the region for decades. This moment did not emerge suddenly, but represents the violent climax of a relationship shaped by oil ideology, power, and resistance. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela and the United States were not enemies but partners connected through energy trade and strategic cooperation. Venezuela's vast oil reserves made it a cornerstone of U.S. energy security, and American companies were deeply embedded in the country's petroleum sector. This partnership began to fracture at the turn of the century with the rise of Hugo Chavez, who framed U.S. influence as a form of economic colonialism. Chavez's Bolivarian revolution rejected neoliberalism, nationalized key industries, and positioned Venezuela as a leader of anti-U.S. resistance in Latin America. Under Chavez, Venezuela aligned with Cuba, Russia, and later China, using oil diplomacy to build regional influence and challenge Washington's dominance. When Chavez died and Nicolás Maduro assumed power, the ideological confrontation remained, but the economic foundation collapsed. Mismanagement, falling oil prices, and sanctions plunged Venezuela into a prolonged crisis marked by inflation, shortages, and mass emigration. The United States responded with escalating sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and recognition of opposition figures, arguing that Maduro's government lacked democratic legitimacy. For years, this conflict remained largely economic and political, with Washington betting that pressure would force change from within. Caracas responded by tightening control, suppressing dissent, and framing all hardship as the result of foreign aggression. This standoff created a fragile equilibrium. Neither side could resolve, but both could endure. That balance began to erode in the mid-2020s when U.S. policy shifted from containment to confrontation. The shift was driven by a growing narrative inside Washington that Venezuela was no longer simply authoritarian, but criminalized. U.S. officials increasingly accused senior Venezuelan figures of direct involvement in drug trafficking and transnational crime. The country was reframed not as a failed democracy, but as a security threat operating within criminal networks. This reframing was crucial because it justified a different category of response. Once Venezuela was defined as a hub for narco-terrorism, the use of military and law enforcement tools became politically and legally viable. In 2025, the United States expanded its naval and aerial presence in the Caribbean, officially under counter-narcotics operations. Warships, surveillance aircraft, and drones began operating closer to Venezuelan waters. Venezuela viewed these moves as preparation for intervention rather than policing. In response, Maduro mobilized troops, expanded emergency powers, and warned repeatedly of an imminent U.S. attack. Incidents multiplied, including maritime interceptions, drone encounters, and reported strikes on vessels allegedly linked to trafficking. Each incident increased the risk of miscalculation and narrowed the space for de-escalation. Analysts warned that the line between counter-drug operations and direct military conflict had effectively disappeared. By the end of 2025, the situation was primed for ignition. January 3rd became the spark. Explosions in Caracas and surrounding areas signaled that confrontation had turned kinetic. U.S. officials described the strikes as targeted operations tied to security objectives. The claim that Maduro had been captured elevated the moment from military escalation to potential regime decapitation. Venezuela's rejection of the claim introduced a dangerous layer of uncertainty. In modern conflict, uncertainty is not neutral. It destabilizes institutions, markets, and public psychology. Even the possibility that leadership has been removed can trigger internal fractures. This is why information warfare now runs parallel to military action. Each side seeks to control the narrative because perception shapes behavior. For Venezuela, the strikes validate long-standing claims of imperial aggression. For the United States, they represent decisive action after years of frustration. This clash of narratives leaves little room for compromise. Regional implications are immediate because Latin America has not witnessed direct U.S. military action of this scale in decades. Governments across the region fear precedent regardless of ideology. The principle of sovereignty is being tested in real time. Internationally, the crisis intersects with broader geopolitical rivalries. Countries aligned with Venezuela view U.S. action as part of a larger pattern of power projection. Others remain cautious, waiting to see whether escalation continues or stabilizes. Inside Venezuela, the consequences are potentially severe. Years of crisis have hollowed out institutions, leaving little resilience. Any disruption risks accelerating humanitarian collapse and displacement. For the United States, the risks are equally profound. Military action without a clear end state invites long-term entanglement. History offers no shortage of examples. This is why January 3rd should be understood not as an endpoint, but as the beginning of a new phase. A phase where decisions made under pressure will shape regional order for years. The path forward is uncertain because escalation creates momentum. Reversal becomes politically costly. Every move now carries amplified consequences. Understanding how this moment came to be is essential because it reveals the structural forces at play. Oil ideology, security, and power converged over decades to produce this rupture. The question now is not only what happens next, but whether restraint remains possible. In the next video, we move inside Washington to examine the strategic logic, political incentives, and legal frameworks that pushed the United States from sanctions to force. Because to understand the future of this crisis, we must first understand the decisions that ignited it. To understand how the situation reached the point of open military confrontation, it is necessary to step back and look at the deeper roots of the U.S.-Venezuela relationship, which for most of the 20th century was defined not by hostility, but by cooperation, especially in energy and trade. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and for decades, it was one of Washington's most important energy partners, supplying crude to U.S. markets and hosting American oil companies that played a major role in the country's economy. That relationship began to fracture at the turn of the century with the rise of Hugo Chavez, whose Bolivarian revolution was built explicitly on rejecting U.S. influence, nationalizing resources, and repositioning Venezuela as a symbol of resistance to American dominance in Latin America. Under Chavez, Venezuela aligned itself with countries openly hostile to Washington, including Cuba, Russia, and later China, while using oil diplomacy to expand its influence across the region and fund domestic social programs that strengthened his political base. When Chavez died and Nicolás Maduro took power, the ideological confrontation remained. But Venezuela's internal situation deteriorated rapidly as mismanagement, sanctions, and collapsing oil prices pushed the country into economic crisis. The United States responded not with military force, but with escalating sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and recognition of opposition figures as legitimate alternatives to Maduro's government, arguing that Venezuela was no longer a functioning democracy. For years, this standoff remained largely political and economic, with Washington betting that pressure would eventually force change from within, while Caracas accused the U.S. of economic warfare and regime change operations. That fragile balance began to collapse in the mid-2020s, when U.S. policy shifted from containment to active disruption, driven by two overlapping narratives, one about national security and the other about criminal networks. U.S. officials increasingly framed the Venezuelan state not merely as authoritarian, but as a hub for transnational crime, alleging that senior figures in Maduro's government were directly involved in drug trafficking through networks such as the so-called Cartel de los Soles. This framing mattered because it allowed Washington to move the issue out of the diplomatic sphere and into the security domain, where military and law enforcement tools could be justified under counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism authorities. In 2025, the U.S. expanded its naval and air presence in the Caribbean, deploying warship surveillance aircraft and drones near Venezuelan waters officially to interdict drug trafficking routes, but unmistakably signaling a readiness to escalate. Venezuela interpreted these moves not as policing actions, but as preparations for intervention, and responded by mobilizing troops, activating militias, and granting the president expanded emergency powers to deal with what it called an imminent foreign threat. As rhetoric-hardened incidents multiplied with maritime interceptions, drone sightings, and reported strikes on vessels allegedly linked to narcotics trafficking, raising the risk of miscalculation with every encounter. What makes this moment particularly volatile is that it unfolds in a media environment where information moves faster than verification, allowing claims, counterclaims, and speculation to shape public perception in real time. In such conditions, decisions made under pressure can lock actors into paths that become difficult to reverse, especially when credibility and deterrence are perceived to be on the line. This is why the events of January 3rd should not be seen as an endpoint, but as the opening phase of a new and unpredictable chapter in U.S.-Venezuela relations. Whether this chapter leads to negotiated outcomes, internal transformation, prolonged conflict, or regional destabilization will depend on choices made in the coming days, not only in Washington and Caracas, but in capitals around the world. In the next video, we will move inside the United States itself, examining the strategic logic, domestic political pressures, and security doctrines that shaped Washington's shift from sanctions and containment to direct military action. Because to understand where this crisis is going next, we must first understand how it became possible at all.